Okay, so actually I want to take up from where I want to sort of pick up from not necessarily exactly from where we left off, but if you remember in the last class, I talked about how anthropologists were very interested in kinship and kinship relationships. And this is something that so became kind of a joke that anthropologists were so interested in kinship, they became kinshipology. And we came up with these sort of symbols for different things. And some people get into this stuff now. They do like their genealogies, and so anthropologists were in some ways partially responsible for these things that we call the kinship chart, or some people do them on their genealogies. And so if you want to fool around with this a little bit, sometimes in class I have people trace back as far as they can in their families and do this a little bit. So that red box there, that would be ego is always you. You start with you, and then you'd go back and you can see these would be your parents. The triangle is for a male, and the circle is for a female. And we don't know. I don't know anything of. Whoa, hey, go back. I don't know anything about but you would then have you could have a brother and a sister here. And if somebody dies, you do that. And if somebody gets divorced, you do that. And these lines indicate descent, and these lines indicate blood relationships, and this is a marriage. And so, you can, like I said, you can do that, and just fool around with it a little bit. But the idea was this was something that anthropologists went out and would interview people and then try and figure out, okay, this is your uncle or this is your aunt. What do you call them? What role do they play in your life? Who's related to whom? Who inherits stuff from whom? Now, in our society, if we start drawing our kinship chart out, we believe that we are related to people equally on our mother and father's side. Or most of us believe that. And that is what is called a bilateral kinship system. So if you want to start drawing this out for yourself, you would actually usually start with the paper in like landscape mode, like this, because you're going to be going way far. It's going to be very wide in terms of your kinship system, and usually not very deep. So most of us in the United States can name, say, our grandparents, and we can name maybe some great-grandparents, but most people can't go back more than about 3 or 4 generations, at least in their head. And that's because the kinship system gets very wide. So, we usually have 2 grandparents, 4 great-grandparents, then you'd have 8 great-grandparents, etc. So then by the time you're at great-great-grandparents, that would be 16 people more to remember there. Now, bilateral kinship systems are quite common, but there's also another form of kinship system, which is called unilineal. And in unilineal kinship system, you consider yourself more or even exclusively related to one parent or the other. And so you're actually then, so maybe an example will help. A patrilineal kinship system, you would basically trace your lineage through your father's side. And that is where you would get your inheritance. And in some societies, you would consider yourself more or even exclusively biologically or kinship-wise related to people on your father's side. And you wouldn't really worry that much about your mother's side, and you wouldn't really consider that side to be your relatives. And if you're dealing with a unilineal kinship system, they can often name like 6 or 7 generations deep back, because it's more sort of vertical, you might say. You would start with your paper like this, and you'd be able to go deep back because you had a unilineal kinship system. We do have a little bit, most of us have a little bit of patrilineality in our kinship system. How would we know that we have a tiny bit of patrilineality in our kinship system. If you were to draw back, where do most of us get our last names from?
Dads.
Dads, most of us. Not all the time, sometimes it changes. Yeah, so we have, although we consider ourselves to be bilateral kinship, we get most of our names, at least, our last names from our patrilineal side. Not all the time. On a sort of mirror image to that is a matrilineal kinship system, in which people would consider themselves to be more, they would get their names and their inheritance and their stuff from their mother's side. And so these are less common than patrilineal systems, but a lot of people in, actually a lot of Native American groups had matrilineal, and still do have matrilineal kinship systems. And so in some of these cases, where we talked about in the last class, how a husband would leave their own place and go live with a matrilocal society, that often corresponds with a matrilineal society as well. And in these societies, as one of you pointed out, it's often very important to distinguish father's uncle, father's brother, or your uncle on your father's side, and your uncle on your mother's side. So we have just the same word to indicate uncle and aunt. But if you lived in a matrilineal kinship system, your mother's side, your mother's side uncle would be much more important to you than your father's side uncle, because that would be kind of where you were getting your inheritance from, and where you're getting your sort of family traditions from would be carried on the mother's side. And so they often have two different words for aunt and uncle, depending on whether it's mother's brother, mother's sister, father's brother, father's sister. So these are indications of different ways in which people feel that they are biologically or sort of kinship related to different kinds of people. So it's simply the case that in different societies, these relationships are felt differently and handled differently. You don't have to copy this down, but this is an example of, in different societies, also your cousins might be considered differently. So if you lived in a, let's go with a patrilineal society. So if you lived in a patrilineal society and you were the ego there, you were that triangle, you would consider yourself very related to the cousins on your father's side, because that would be where you got most of your relationships from. But your mother's side cousins, what are called cross cousins there, would be at best distantly related to you. And so in fact, in some societies, they would consider a cross cousin marriage to be kind of not necessarily an ideal, but maybe a good thing to do. And so, and I guess I don't want to make it sound all icky because you're marrying your first cousin, but in some senses, they would consider that to be not a close relationship because you're not really related to each other. And I would just say, don't worry, the genetics get mixed up again because we all have exogamous relationships coming into the picture. But in some societies, they would prefer a kind of cross-cousin marriage in some cases. So what this adds up to is the importance of how kinship is made, even if it is born. So as we've just talked about with certain unilineal kinship systems, there are some people who seem to be biologically related or genetically related who if you lived in a unilineal kinship society, would not be considered to be kin, or not be considered to be close kin, or might be considered to have different kinds of kinship relationships. So the ways in which people think about kinship is not necessarily given in biological descent. The other thing is that other people can become like kin. And so Muckle and Gonzalez mentioned the idea of fictive, what we sometimes call fictive kinship, which can be as important or equally important as biological kinship. Muckle and Gonzalez also mentioned the idea of nurture kinship. So in many societies, I think, including our own, but we don't necessarily think about it as explicitly this way. In many societies, those people who give you food, especially who feed you when you're growing up, are your kin, or are seen as biologically related to you. And if you think about food, food is itself a biological process, and so providing food to someone is extremely important in many societies and can be used as a form of kinship. So even if people believe that they are biologically related, and are, as we would say, are blood relations, I think we all realize that we have to sort of maintain those relationships. We have to nurture them. We have to grow them. There is more to being a father or a mother than simply biologically procreating. And I think many of us have probably personal experience with some people who are biologically related, but don't act like kin, and others who are perhaps more distant, but have been hugely important in our lives and are like our brothers or sisters or family members. This is a very important insight, I think, from anthropology, that kinship is always a social thing. You might be biologically related or genetically related to people, but it has to be made socially as well. Now, if you think back to the those circles and triangles that anthropologists start with, those correspond to what we call to males and females. And in recent years, or I should say in, I don't know, the last 20 or 30 years, anthropologists and other social scientists have started to distinguish between what we call sex and what we call gender. And so sex refers to biological differences between different people. We'll stick now for male and female. We'll talk about how much that holds true a little bit later, but let's stick here for male and female. So we'd say, you know, there are biological differences, and hormones, sex traits, reproductive organs. And so we would talk about those biological differences, but we would separate that from the roles or the expectations that are placed upon people with those biological differences. So one of you mentioned that, you know, in our society, sometimes we expect girls to be feminine, which means sort of the weaker sex, or we think of it that way. Whereas in other societies, they might value female upper body strength, being able to plow a field. So there's all sorts of expectations or ideas that we place upon people, and those social roles and expectations are called gender. Now, one of the things, this is a scientific distinction that we make between the biological stuff, sex, and the gender stuff, which is the social role and expectation. You should know that when it comes to people out there in the world, I think people thought that the word gender sounded more polite than sex for obvious reasons. And so people often use the word, or sometimes use the word gender when they probably should mean sex. So my best example is that when my wife and I had an ultrasound for our first pregnancy, and my grandmother asked, well, did they tell you the gender of the baby? And she really probably should have said, did they tell you the sex of the baby? Because we're looking for biological organs there. The gender are all the expectations that we load on to the baby before the baby even comes out. So just be aware that, you know, in popular terms, these things are sometimes interchanged. Now, one of the interesting things that anthropologists can tell us about what goes on with gender is that we usually think of gender, or had thought of gender until maybe about 10 years ago, as coming in two different roles. So masculine and feminine, corresponding to male and female. But if we look around the world and we look historically, there are actually a lot of different societies that have more than two genders, or more than two ideas about social roles for individuals. One of the most famous examples is actually comes to us from Native American and First Nation societies. You know, there's not one term for people like this, but one of the sort of more overarching or popular terms that Native Americans have been trying to recuperate are called two-spirit people. And two-spirit people might be biologically male but take on female gender roles, or they might be biologically female but take on male gender roles, or they might have their own special role in society. That is to say, they would be sort of neither male nor female. They would be kind of be at the interstitial area, and they may even be seen as having a valuable, an especially valuable role to play there. Now, I guess I would say that a lot of when it came to expressions of sexuality, it seems like some of the two-spirit people were involved in what we might consider homosexual acts. But that didn't necessarily mean that they had the identity, as we'll talk about later, of being homosexual, because in fact, they wouldn't even correspond to our idea of having only two genders. So how to say, if you have sex with a third gender individual, what does that make you? It doesn't really correspond to an identity that we would have in our society. I should mention that in the old literature, in the old accounts of people like this, they were sometimes referred to as berdache, which is a term that the French used for a male prostitute. So it's a derogatory term. It does sometimes show up in older writings, but we don't use that term anymore. Like I said, most Native American and First Nation groups that are trying to recuperate some of these identities are gravitating to terms like two-spirit peoples. One of the important things that I want to mention here, and it's a kind of a theme for this chapter, is that a lot of the things that we think of as, oh, this just happened here, or this is a very recent thing, turn out to be quite old and different when you look cross-culturally. So we've been talking about two-spirit people in North America. There's an interesting website on PBS that talks about it. It's actually for a film called Two Spirits, a project. And, you know, what they document is that there are hundreds of societies throughout the world and throughout history that have had 3 or more genders. So this occurs actually on every continent and in many different societies. Now, that brings us to this article that I assigned, which is the Kralik article, What Our Skeletons Say About the Sex Binary. And I think it's a pretty easy to read piece. I hope it's pretty, in some ways, self-explanatory, and it does kind of say something about contemporary gender identity. But she also goes back and looks at some of the archaeological identification. You may remember in one of our earlier classes, we were online at the time, and I popped up a big picture of the pelvis identifications. And this kind of comes up again here, where Kralik says, you know, what's interesting is they would look back at these archaeological sites and find out that people had identified, like, you know, had over-identified male skeletons in the record. And when they looked at these again, they decided that, you know, a lot of these weren't quite so clear. I mean, for one thing, it should be basically 50-50. And so some of these were not quite as clear as they thought, in part because it's not, you know, as we saw in our pelvis identification stuff, there's some general biological aspects to the differences between male and female, but that's part of a range or a spectrum. It's not some sort of one giveaway feature in here. I also like this article because it relates to a number of issues that we can think about in terms of sports. It is true that during the Olympics and other sporting events, you know, women especially get very excessively tested, and there's all these sort of tests to determine. So you may have heard of Caster Semenya, who sort of naturally produces testosterone, and it was actually ruled that in order to keep competing, she would be forced to take testosterone reducing drugs. So these issues are very complicated, and they're probably not going to go away. And so I just wanted to kind of bring them up. I think this leads to a larger question, is that a lot of people are willing to accept that there may be more than 2 or 3 social genders or cultural genders. But there's a bigger question, is it that we have, or that we have insisted in our society on a gender binary, which then makes us see a biological sex binary? So I'm going to leave this open as a question. I'm not going to say that this is true. I think what we do know, though, is that what we used to think of as this sort of totally clear-cut distinction between male and female biologically has become, as we know more about the development of humans, that it's a lot messier than we thought back in the day. There's an interesting article, an essay by Anne Fausto Sterling, who wrote an article called The 5 Sexes, Why Male and Female Are Not Enough. And she was not necessarily arguing that we needed 5 different sex categories, but what she was saying is that people mix up differently in terms of their sex organs, in terms of their chromosomes, in terms of their hormone levels, and the idea that we are simply divided naturally into male and female, or biologically into male and female, is in part a kind of artifact of our own society. And we actually see, we've seen that people are born with sometimes what they call anomalous or intersex biological conditions, typically in American society, we've tried to surgically fix individuals that are born sort of ambiguous. I think fortunately now there's been a little bit of a movement to kind of say, well, let's let the child develop a little bit before we try to decide what exactly which gender or sex they should be fit into. And you don't have to copy this down. This was actually from the WHO, the World Health Organization, talking about gender and genetics. And it's interesting that even at the chromosomal level, there are a lot of people who are born like, we typically think of people as XY or what is it, XX or XY, but there are actually a fair number of people who are born and live their life with a third chromosome being XXY or XYY or XXX, or different kinds of chromosomal things. So as the WHO says, there's a range of chromosome complements, hormone balances, and phenotypic variations that determine sex. So this is, I think that for the most part, a lot of people break down into a sex binary, but I think we need to understand that the genetics and the biology are perhaps a little more complicated than we were once raised to believe, or I was once raised to believe. Also in this chapter, we talk a little bit about sexuality and sexual acts and sexual identity. So in some ways similar to how we talked about romantic love. So the whole idea that people come as gay or straight, and there's two varieties of people, and that's your identity, is actually a fairly recent idea. That's probably even more recent than romantic love. That's probably more like from the 1950s, I would say, onward. So this, like I said, this idea that people fall into either a heterosexual or a homosexual category, and that would be your identity as a person, is a somewhat recent thing that people are doing. And so if we look over different societies and we look over time and we look over history, there have always been heterosexual acts, and there's also always been homosexual acts. And so people do different things with each other, but that doesn't necessarily mean they identify as a homosexual or a heterosexual. And one of you noted that there's actually a very famous example in anthropology of the Itoro. This is going to sound a little weird, but they consider, the males consider semen to be very powerful. And so they believe that you need to ingest semen of other males in order to receive more power so that you can have heterosexual intercourse later. Which, like I said, is going to sound a little weird, but you can see that, it's not an identity to be homosexual or heterosexual. They would say that you need one substance from men in order to later have sex with women. Like I said, kind of bizarre, but it's even so. If we take away, we'll get off that a little bit. We'll talk about something else that's weird. Even in contemporary societies, who would be identified as homosexual or heterosexual does vary around the world. So in many Latin American societies, for example, men who have sex with other men would not necessarily be identified as homosexual. They may have an idea about, there's different ideas about, oh man, I guess it is hard to do without sounding weird again. There's different ideas about penetration. So if you are the person who is doing the penetrating, you would not consider yourself to be a homosexual, even though you are having sex with other men, and you might be a married man in a heterosexual relationship and also have sex with other men and not consider yourself to be a homosexual. So the way in which we draw those lines varies across different societies. And I guess I would also say that that people in many different societies have had long-term same-sex unions. They haven't obviously been necessarily legalized as marriage, but they might be recognized in some way in different places. Actually, I wanted to comment here on one of you in the discussion board talked about that there was a law, I think in 2004, that made, what was it? That made homosexuality illegal. And that wasn't technically true. The law in the United States made homosexual or same-sex marriage illegal, and that was subsequently overturned. There were, of course, laws against what was called, sodomy or homosexuality, but those dated to earlier times, and most of those were abolished before 2004. So, big point. A number of you got into the body modification stuff at this, and that's interesting. The tattooing and the neck rings and all different ways in which people pierce and do all this stuff to their bodies is some really interesting stuff. People have also been doing gender bending and third genders and had social ideas that were then imposed upon other people's bodies. People have, as we talked about in the last class, have had various ways of getting married to each other and done, what was that called? Polyandry, and had polyandrous relationships and complex sexualities. And my reason for listing this all out is, as several of you pointed out in your comments, sometimes we think, oh, this is what's been happening in the last 10 years in the United States, that all of a sudden we're now more open about, all gender bathrooms, and we have tattoos, and we have piercings, and people have sex operations, and these in different kinds of families. And my big point here is that if we look all the way around the world at different societies, and if we look through time, we discover that a lot of these things are not unique to the United States, and they've been going on for a long time, thousands of years. In fact, some of the body modification stuff is probably a lot more intense than I would ever want any of my kids to do. So I'm not recommending this stuff, but I just want us to put into context when we were thinking about the diversity of sexual, gender, kinship expression in the United States, that this has been something that has been with us